Welcome to the Society for Economic Anthropology's podcast, Mergers and Acquisitions. I'm Tanya Martin, and today I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Dr. Taylor Nelms as part of our series titled Economic Anthropology Otherwise. Dr. Taylor Nelms is an anthropologist and ethnographer with 15 years of experience studying money, technology, and banking in the United States, Latin America, and in other parts of the world. He is currently the Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute, an independent nonprofit think tank focused on consumer and cooperative finance, especially credit unions. At Filene, Taylor manages a team of researchers and a portfolio of partnerships with leading scholars to pursue research that explores people's changing economic lives and the business of financial services. Before joining Filene, Taylor worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Irvine, where he also received his PhD in anthropology. He also holds degrees from the University of Cambridge and Ohio State University. Welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you with us, especially since you've been at the forefront, I think, of developing a sort of public economic anthropology. But to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your academic research and how it relates to the anthropology of economic life, broadly conceived?
Well, thanks, Tanya. I don't think that anyone has ever told me that I've been at the forefront of anything. And I certainly don't consider myself to be at the forefront of a public economic anthropology, but it is something that matters to me a great deal. So it's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. And I hope that this jumpstarts deeper and broader conversations with the Society for Economic Anthropology and among anthropologists, academic and otherwise, more broadly. But yeah, so as an academic, of course, I'm trained as an anthropologist and ethnographer, but I've always been, I would say, a very curious person, especially about stuff that doesn't make sense to me. I've always been drawn to the parts of life, the parts of my experiences or other people's experiences that just simply don't make sense, at least on their face. So I think part of the result of that is that my academic work has been a little bit of a tasting menu, honestly, probably more wide than deep. But that said, I think that there are no doubt, especially in retrospect, some consistencies and commonalities. So I've been broadly interested in money and technology as they intersect in people's everyday economic and political lives. So I've been especially interested in how people make and maintain alternative economies or economies that aren't called alternative, from the U.S. credit union movement to Latin American cooperativism. So this has taken on a few different forms. So first, I've been really interested, and this is the subject of my dissertation work, on the meaning and practice of solidarity in economic life, especially as it relates to forms of cooperative finance and post-neoliberal government, if we can call it that, in Latin America. So my dissertation was based on fieldwork in Quito, Ecuador, with urban market vendors and family and neighborhood savings groups, as well as bureaucrats and experts, really, who studied and often celebrated those people and those groups as exemplars of economic alterity that was really defined by its orientation to the social. And for those listening, I'm doing that in scare quotes, the social. So, in this work, I've really tried to understand the ways that the romance of solidarity or the romance of the social belies the relational and especially organizational labor that it takes to make and maintain. It takes a lot of work to build solidarity and maintain solidarity. Second, I've really tried to track how many of the tools that we dismiss too often as flattening or dissolving the social in some way. So that's definitely money, but it's also technology, law, bureaucracy. So many of these tools are actually embraced in practice, at least by the people who are making and maintaining solidarity-based alternative economies. Specifically, leveraging those kinds of tools to relieve the burdens of the labors of maintenance, of organizational labor and relational labor. So that's been one sort of track of thinking. The other has been on the promises and the politics of new financial technologies. So mobile phone-based money transfer systems like M-Pesa in Kenya or many of the other mobile money systems around the world, or more kind of here in the United States, the fintech boom or bubble in the post global financial crisis US, with a special focus on payments, so how people move and manage their money. And all of that kind of within the broader kind of digital transformation and real remaking of the financial services ecosystem in the 10 years or 15 years, almost 15 years since the global financial crisis, and now in the midst and wake of COVID-19. So in this work, I've tried to track how experiments with money and technology seek to disintermediate different kinds of commercial and governmental institutions. But in doing so, how they also attempt to then remake the infrastructures of trust and credibility and authority. So, for example, challenging or attempting to challenge the state's monopoly over money. And I see a lot of these experiments as paradigmatic of the many transformations that folks are studying kind of across disciplines and inside and outside academia around kind of platform intermediation and venture capitalism, marketing and consumption, data economies, and especially the kind of evolving technologies and norms around privacy and surveillance. And kind of at the intersection of both of these tracks, I've been specifically doing a lot of work through my job outside of academia on credit unions in the ongoing transformation of the US financial services system. And honestly, really just trying to understand the business of banking and how it's been transformed. And I can talk a lot about that. That's what I do kind of day in and day out. But I'm especially interested in the pressures on the traditional business, banking business models, and the way that those pressures are throwing up new conundrums, especially for community-based financial services providers like credit unions.
That's great. Thank you so much for delving into that impressive range of themes and concepts and ideas. And we'll definitely come back to your work at Filene in a little bit. But I was just struck very much by the themes that you brought up, including economic alterity, solidarity, community banking. And I'm wondering what you see as some of the challenges and possibilities of doing public scholarship on these themes. Is there sort of a relationship between the themes that you study and the necessity to engage public fora in different ways?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, Danya, and maybe like the core question that I've been asking myself during my time as I've transitioned out of a formal position in academia and into this kind of hybrid world where I work today. I have become more interested in many ways in the forms of knowledge production and circulation, maybe more interested in those forms than in the content of the knowledge itself, than in the kind of the arguments that I would make, right, as an academic. And I've become especially drawn to kind of practical experiments in knowledge production and circulation, especially in and through organizational work and institution building. And I've started to wonder, just to repeat your question in a different way, how what I've researched has shaped my concern for how ideas and knowledge gets generated and gets circulated, how that knowledge emerges, how it travels, and especially what difference it makes or it can make. So, in terms of the content of my arguments kind of in the academic world, I've really been trying to argue that the formal and informal systems that we use to move and store and keep track of value are all undergirded by all kinds of social and technical infrastructures that themselves require energy and care to make and maintain. And honestly, increasingly, I've started to see them that they should be seen and treated as a kind of public good, simplify. And so I've been really less interested in, I don't know, the isms, so to speak, than the icks, that kind of the ICSs, right? The techniques and pragmatics, the poetics, the rhetorics, the aesthetics, the metrics and statistics. And so, I have some empirical commitments to understanding how the social and economic are made and maintained, especially when it comes to race and class and gender and generation, has kind of empirics of the social. But I've also been increasingly oriented to trying to understand what my work can do, what those arguments can do for audiences other than other anthropologists or other academics. So just to give you some examples, in the Ecuadorian context, I think this has meant gently pushing back against some of the ongoing efforts, including by people who I consider myself in alliance with in many ways, to mobilize the social as a way to mark the limits of or offer an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, in the terms of many of my colleagues there. Not at least not without paying attention to the many kind of uneven forms of labor and knowledge and technology that support social life itself as a kind of political project. In the U.S. context, and especially as I interface with folks in industry, in financial services, my colleagues and I have tried to argue that the many kind of fintech experiments that seek to disintermediate all of these institutions, banks and government in particular, what these experiments are up to is not so much disintermediation as re-intermediation, often through processes of enclosure and privatization. And so there, the critique is also about how we need to find ways to protect and support and make and maintain infrastructures of relationships, right? Relational infrastructures that allow for the circulation of value, of information, and data. So, just to kind of circle back to your question, I do think that there's something about these two sites, so to speak, of my academic work that has lent itself to me thinking more about the ways knowledge gets made and the ways that it travels, and especially what can you do with it technically, what can you do with it pragmatically, and especially what can you do with it politically.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I especially love the comment about not isms, but icks. That's great. I love that. Okay, now we've heard a little bit about your sort of more academic research, but I'd love to hear your experience outside of sort of traditional academia. So you're currently Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute. So could you talk a little bit about how you came to work at this institution and sort of explain what kind of work the organization does and what work you do within it on an everyday basis? Yeah.
Let me give you the facts first, and then, I think I have still a lot to process in terms of what it means, right? I started at Filene about 4.5 years ago. I initially, I don't know how they found me or found, I was initially working with Filene in partnership with a great mentor of mine, Bill Maurer at the University of California, Irvine. And we were doing some contract research for them. And I'm not entirely sure how they found us, but they reached out to us to ask if we would do some research on fintech, on payments in particular, and the impacts on credit unions. So that was the initial engagement, was a one-off research project, basically a grant for Bill and I was Bill's postdoc at the time, to do some work for Filene and hopefully of relevance to credit unions. I then had the opportunity, when their former director of research left the organization to take a job with a credit union, I had the opportunity to apply and join the organization. I ended up making I had to make a choice. I was on the academic job market at the same time. And so I was very extraordinarily lucky in that I had a tenure track position at a liberal arts university that was offered to me at the same time. And it was a difficult choice ultimately, Tanya, because, I'd always dreamed I wanted to be a professor. I very fortunate to have that opportunity. And I think as many, many, many folks are realizing and have continued to realize that the vision we have for the kind of work that we want to accomplish in tenure track positions or other positions within academia doesn't line up, or is increasingly disjointed from the reality of those positions. It only through conversations with my partner, my spouse, who's not an academic, was I able to really kind of puzzle out what did I want to do for real, apart from the role and the institution. And it felt like at that time, and I honestly, I'm glad I made this choice, although sad also about, paths not taken. But ultimately, I think what I wanted to do in terms of both the research and in terms of supporting other people's work was going to be much easier to do it at Filene than inside of academia. So it was an attractive role for a number of reasons. One, I could keep my foot in research and in academic research, especially because Filene does so much of its original research with university-based researchers. But two, during my time as a postdoc, I had the opportunity in a couple of ways to support other people's work, either as an editor. I was editor-in-chief at that time of the Journal of Cultural Economy, which is an interdisciplinary, an international journal that looks at cultural economy, the impacts of culture in society. And I was also, as a postdoc, working with Bill Maurer, helping other researchers around the world who were affiliated with a research institute at UC Irvine called the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion to do their projects that we were also funding. So I was participating in grant making too. And so I had a real taste for that. Like I wanted to do my own work, but I also really, really, really enjoyed helping other people work on their projects. And so Filene allowed me kind of to do both of those things. And honestly, it felt like I was going back into the field. So as I kind of transitioned out of academia into Filene, I also had the opportunity to kind of put an ethnographer's hat back on, and to learn something new, in some ways from the inside out, right? Because so much of what Filene does is work directly with credit unions and other financial services providers and vendors and partners. And so I'm involved day to day in credit union business, financial services business, trying to understand, what consumers want out of a financial services provider, what technology can do in this space, what are the kind of business strategies, everything from all of that stuff to thinking about talent attraction and retention and professional development. So that there's a pretty eclectic portfolio of work. So that's how I came to work at Filene. You already said, Filene is an independent nonprofit think tank. We're focused primarily on credit unions, but certainly our mandate is broader to think about consumer finance, consumer financial services. Generally, we're supported by credit unions. So even though we definitely do a lot of grant-based work, it's also an enviable position as an organization because we have a kind of built-in audience, right? The credit unions who support us are also there to learn from the work that we do. And that's our goal. We joke that we're kind of B to B to C. We're like business to business to consumer rather than a lot of, fintech startups might be B2C or we're not an advocacy shop like a policy think tank. Our goal is to help credit unions do their work better. So ultimately they can help serve their members and positively impact their communities better. So so in that way, there's a lot of, I've been thinking a lot about leverage, right? The ways that we Filene leverage ideas, leverage insights, leverage knowledge, the way that a bank might leverage money. And hopefully there are ramifying effects of the work that we do as it circulates in the financial services world.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. That sounds like such an interesting organization doing such important work. If I might just have a sort of quick follow-up question. You mentioned your postdoc experience, and I know you also did a PhD at UC Irvine with Professor Bill Mauro. And I'm wondering how the experience specifically with IMFTI, which is also kind of a publicly engaged institute, shaped, your line of work or your thinking in particular ways.
Yeah, I was pretty lucky to have the opportunity, I think, to do that work with IMTFI, the institute at UC Irvine. That institute was founded with a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation of all organizations. And I think honestly, when we first started, the core kind of debate internally and externally was, can we do this work and not be compromised in some way by some kind of philanthropic industrial complex or something? I shouldn't joke that, but you know what I mean. And I think what we found was that there was all sorts of ways to build really strong and compelling relationships with other researchers, even within that public relationship with the Gates Foundation. And we were able to find fellow travelers, I guess, in all sorts of institutions. And so the experience really opened up for me the idea that, and I'll probably say this again later in the podcast, but the idea that there's no real great divide between academic work and other kinds of work or work outside the institutions of academia, that the politics are of a piece. And in fact, there's a lot to gain, I think, a great deal to gain in recognizing that we have shared political struggles. I think the ongoing, at this point, when we're recording this podcast, labor struggles of workers in the UCs is a really powerful example of the ways that we need to recognize the shared political struggles across the institutional divides and cultural divides between academia and industry and nonprofits and government. So definitely that experience opened me up to thinking differently about how I might navigate the political and ethical dilemmas of doing work, doing research, and other kinds of work, inside, outside, alongside academia. I would also say that it really taught me very early on that so much of our day-to-day work, whether it's inside of academia or outside of academia, is not really about like ideas or writing or reading, but it's much more honestly administrative. It's like meetings and phone calls and workshops and memos and like project management and donor relations and right. I mean, that's the day-to-day work. But I mean, only in retrospect do I see this. But when I think about the work that so many of my friends and colleagues in Ecuador did to build and maintain institutions and organizations and networks that could contain in them the seeds of alterity, that was what they were doing. They weren't just thinking big thoughts. They were like in the, administrative and relational labor of building, networks and creating organizations and trying to keep those organizations alive and running. Look, activists and community organizers know that, right? Because that's the work that they live day in and day out. I think sometimes the researcher in me and the researcher maybe in all of us can forget that. And so I think it's really important just to recognize that that so much of the work that we do is that kind of administrative and organizational labor, and we should value that. So the experiences, at IMTFI taught me, I think, or opened me up to thinking about what is possible and what is necessary differently. Yeah, I mean, and then there were some real practical things too. I mean, IMTFI was founded, I think, in part because of the exigencies of, the bankruptcy of higher education, not to put too fine a point on it, right? But the fact that, most people can't do research inside of academia without financial support. And so we have to think differently about where the money is going to come from, where the time is going to come from. And so IMTFI, I think, was created out of that demand, right? How are we going to fund research around the world on mobile money, on money and technology? The Gates Foundation provided us a vehicle to do that. But certainly, it introduces new demands and new challenges, right? So it's not, it's kind of shifting, right, the ways that the folks that we interface with, the organizations that we have to navigate, the kinds of challenges that we have to confront.
Yeah, those are so many great important points. I think especially about that there is no kind of clear divide between academia and sort of non-academic institutions, and they share so many common struggles and compromises in both. And I think that's especially important as so many of us young scholars move into other kinds of roles and institutions, both out of necessity, but also out of interest and desire to do something different.
Yeah.
So just to continue with a little bit of the IMTFI question and your work with Professor Bill Maurer, I know you've thought a lot about this question of anthropology and its publics, and especially through a webinar series, which is titled Criticism Inside, Alternatives Outside, Alongside, Organizing Otherwise to Intervene in Anthropology's Future, which was sponsored by UC Irvine and the Werner Gren Foundation. I encourage everyone to go and listen and watch these recorded webinars online. So could you tell us a little bit about what inspired this series and what are some of the lessons you took away from it about the future of the discipline and its publics?
Yeah, I think what inspired the initial idea, and it's one I'm still, I told you right at the outset that I'm interested in things I don't understand. And I still don't really understand a lot of like what's happening in terms of, knowledge production and circulation inside, outside, alongside academia. I don't have good ways of talking about that. And so much of the inspiration for that webinar series, which is really a series of interviews with people who are doing interesting works kind of on those boundaries, or in and around those boundaries, was a really selfish desire to like have a reason for other people to help me puzzle out what's going on with, I don't know what you want to call it, public engaged anthropology, or social science generally. But obviously it was also inspired by the fact that so much of my work, even when it's not administrative, even when it is actual, when it is substantive research, is explicitly applied or otherwise public facing in its form and content. So, no longer just publishing in academic journals or writing for an academic audience, but producing working papers and white papers and interviews and podcasts and other kinds of like circulatable content or outputs. We don't even have like good words to talk about like what these things are. So much of it is also, it doesn't leave a record, right? It's meetings with industry researchers or development professionals. It's like facilitating conversations and workshops. It's jumping on a phone call with a CEO or a consultant, or writing a memo that only exists in your Outlook archive and so on. And those things make a huge difference in terms of the circulation of new ideas. And so, I think part of working at Filene has meant learning to move and translate very quickly between all of these different ways of producing knowledge or circulating knowledge. And I think translation is obviously an imperfect metaphor, right? But I think it does have at least one helpful corollary. Translate is all about like carrying across, it's like a bridge, or it's like a door, or a telephone wire, or wireless network. So I've really started to think about this work as infrastructural, and that's a conceptual lesson, I think, from my research too. But it's all about like, what are the forms of organizational labor and relational material that we need to build the institutions, to build the networks that allow for the circulation of knowledge and the impact of knowledge, right, in communities where it can take hold and make a difference. So that was really the inspiration. I think some of the things that I've learned was that these like fellow travelers are incredibly important to sustaining yourself, but also doing that translational or bridge building or infrastructural work. And so many of the people that we invited to be on the way and very generously agreed to have these conversations with us, with Bill and I and some of our collaborators, these are folks who I saw as fellow travelers in that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I love how you're thinking about this kind of publicly engaged work as also being infrastructural and organizational labor to build alternatives and think about economic life differently. My next question may be a little bit sort of annoying, given that I know you've said, you think of yourself as many different things and doing kind of different sort of work in this space. But, the title of the series is Economic Anthropology Otherwise, and I know you've also thought about the otherwise alongside inside. And in academia and in social media, there's often these sort of labels that circulate around applied anthropology, which is sort of an older formulation, but now also activist, public, alt-act, community engaged, and so on. So, at the risk of annoying you, could you talk a little bit about sort of, do these labels mean anything to you? Do you identify with them? How do you see your work in relation to, but also beyond these labels? Do they matter?
It's a great question. I'm not annoyed by it at all, because it's one that I constantly struggle with. If I am annoyed by it, it's because I annoy myself, because we do have to just find ways to describe ourselves. I mean, I think part of what I've really been challenged by, and what anyone operating in the current kind of intellectual environment, but also just economic environment, are going to be challenged by is finding ways to make yourself legible and make your skills legible. And what that means is making them commodifiable. I mean, we have to work to eat, unfortunately, sometimes. And so, everyone, I think, is being pressured to be an entrepreneur. I mean, I think Alana Gershon's work, just, to mention somebody who's really well known in the SEA space, really, documents this really well. But lots of folks, I think, are experiencing it, but also researching and writing about it. So I know I have to find ways to describe who it is, who I am, and what it is that I do. I think what's really interesting is that simply the term anthropologist now travels outside of academia well. So I don't necessarily think that we need a modifier. I've increasingly come around to this position. Maybe we need the modifier more inside of academia than we do outside of academia. Maybe, and that's telling. I don't know if I identify personally with applied or activist or community engaged. In different parts of my work, I have done and been that. But certainly not in the work that I do at Filene specifically, or in the work that I'm doing today, even if I would like to do more of it. Public, certainly, I would love to be a more public scholar. I don't think that I'm there yet. I have work to do. I really don't like the term alt-act, just throwing that out there. I think that the academy is just as alt as the world's outside the academy. And again, like I think my big point is there is no great divide. So I don't love that. So yeah, public anthropology, I think, is a great way to think about what anthropology can become. inside of academia and outside of academia. But also just to say that, yes, I know the pressure of labels, and maybe we can find ways to kind of embrace, right, simple and collective, right, identities, professional identities. I'll also just throw in here that, the how do I put this? One of the things that I think that I learned in that webinar series is that the when of our work is just as important as the what of our work. So it's not just about, the what of anthropology, right? Like the methodologies or the outputs, the insights, of the anthropological work that we do, but when we do them, in terms of how we reach particular communities, speak to those communities, engage with those stakeholders or fellow travelers, and again, this just to give you an example that, and I've already mentioned this, but not just like the white paper, as important as sometimes that is, but sometimes it's the phone call, right, or the conversation, or the email. And those kind of forms, those wins of doing the work that we do as anthropologists, I think are just as important, even though, again, they're very hard to make legible, make legible to, my bosses at Filene, but also, in industry, but also make legible in terms of tracking productivity or impact within the academy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the subject of public anthropology, I think a related question is the question of audience or stakeholders or fellow travelers, which can be sort of other anthropologists and scholars and social scientists, students, activists, industry, community members, and so on. So I'm kind of trying to think about who you see your audience as, or who you want your audience to be, and who do you draw inspiration and support from in imagining and reaching out to those audiences?
Yeah, I think that there is a challenge at the core of framing up the audience for this kind of work. And that is, there are definitely different expectations for research work, or anthropology, depending on who you talk to, whether that person is in government or in industry, what kind of industry, and nonprofits, community-based work or activist work, and obviously within academia as well. And this is the other side of that maybe that tension. At the same time, I really do think that there's a growing, I don't necessarily want to call it a renaissance, but there's a growing community of folks who are speaking to one another in really compelling ways, again, outside or alongside academia. That's really very interdisciplinary. It's not really like anthropology per se. I think that folks find inspiration from a lot of different disciplinary traditions, a lot of different kind of methodological traditions. And so there's this amazing kind of groundswell. Certainly part of it is social media, but certainly not only, in really creative thinking about social science research in the world, and for diverse publics or diverse audiences. So, when I think about my work, it does vary depending on, what kind of project I'm working on. And there is work to do in modulating how you talk and how you write and how you communicate with those different audiences. So certainly, if I were on a podcast where I'd imagine, I'm imagining credit union CEOs or financial services executives were going to be listening, I would be talking in a different way, right? Than this is the podcast for the Society for Economic Anthropology. I know I'm talking to folks who at least, are interested in anthropology, and especially economic anthropology, and especially those inside of academia, because, even though the SCA has so much potential to reach and leverage relationships with folks outside of academia, many of the folks involved are based inside of academia. So I definitely see myself as speaking to both audiences, even though I have to kind of modulate between them. In terms of like my research work, increasingly, my audience is, I hope that my audience is folks inside of financial services institutions, because my goal in that work, it's part of Filene's mission, but it's also part of, what I hope my own work will do, is to change what they do. Right? And that could be small things, changing the ways that leaders talk to their employees. And it could be big things. It could be, helping organizations recognize and leaders inside of organizations recognize the histories of predation and exclusion that have made possible the contemporary financial services landscape, and then helping them think hard about what it means to redress and repair those historical inequities. Those are conversations, and I know sometimes it's hard to imagine it, but those are conversations that do happen outside of academia. They might happen in different ways, but I'm a part of them in the credit union system. And so there is a real opportunity for us to think about, just for example, and this is something that credit union leaders want, to really think about, like, what is the purpose of a community-based financial services provider? What ultimately is the goal? What is the legacy that those institutions want to have in terms of their impact on the communities that they serve? And so there are many, many folks in this world who are trying to reimagine what that value proposition is, and what the partnerships look like. So that, I think, is the core of my audience for my work. But I am increasingly interested in thinking about the many different people who might listen to my work. The other challenging part about this, of course, is that once you put something out into the world, you don't actually have control over who listens to it, uses it, gains inspiration from it. So at a certain point, as soon as I say something, right, I don't have any agency over it, or I have a whole lot of less agency over it than I did previously. So that, I think, is just something that we have to live with as more publicly engaged scholars. And it can be very difficult, I think, sometimes to be accountable to the fact that, your utterances, your writing can take on lives of their own and can sometimes do damage that you didn't expect. For me, you ask about inspiration, so I'll just, throw out some folks that I think with, even if I don't talk with them as much as I'd like to. Certainly, I have academic mentors. I mentioned Bill. I worked with Marilyn Strathern when I was doing my master's degree, and I still think a lot about so many of the things that she told me during that time. The community around the Journal of Cultural Economy is especially important for me. Liz McFall, in particular, has been a great mentor. I have a lot of friends from graduate school, some of whom are in academia, many of whom are not, who I still talk with and think with. Folks like Simone Popperell, who did her PhD at UC Irvine and is now working for Morning Edition at NPR, or folks like Nick Seaver, who also did his PhD at UC Irvine and is now at Tufts and is an academic, really, truly an academic, but has a real public presence as well. Just to name two folks who, and I shouldn't name anyone because, as with any acknowledgements, thanks has to go with apologies, because I'm going to miss so many folks who are really integral to who I am. In my professional life, Paul Dion, who's the research director at Filene, was trained as an anthropologist as well. Didn't finish his PhD, but almost did it at UNC, and so we have that a little bit of that shared experience as well. A woman named Angela Russell, who's an anthropologist at Heart and Mind, who's the chief diversity officer of an insurance company we work very closely with at Filene. A whole slew of credit union executives, and then also other academics from well outside of anthropology. folks who work in business schools like Sekou Bermise at University of North Carolina or Cornell Roberson at Michigan State University, who have given me a lot of inspiration for thinking about how I navigate the interstices, I guess, of the relationship between academic institutions and other organizations and networks.
That's an amazing list of people and, fellow travelers to be in community with, both sort of intellectually, but also politically and socially. I think that's a great list of people. This is a sort of follow-up question just based on what you mentioned in your previous answer about the ways in which you kind of say similar things, but in a different voice, in a different language, depending on your audience, right? It's different when you're talking to anthropologists or credit union executives and so on. And I'm wondering just if you have any thoughts about how training in anthropology needs to be a little bit different in graduate school to kind of bring scholars into these different kinds of conversations and give them the skills to do that translational work, especially since many people want to be more publicly engaged scholars. They want to work in sort of non-academic fields. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about anthropological training vis-a-vis these different kinds of audiences.
Yeah, I do. I'm of two minds about this, Tanya, because there are precious few spaces and times when people are given the freedom to read and write and think without the exigencies of the marketplace or the exigencies of the workplace, both of which are incredibly tyrannical. And so, if there's anything I would like to do, I want to reclaim the value of that. And it's something that, certainly in our rush, and we have to feel this way, right? But in our rush to, make ourselves useful, I think sometimes we undervalue that. So that's the one side. On the other side, yeah, boy, if I definitely think there are ways that I could have, done better for myself, in making myself useful, not just for Filene as an employer, right, but in the kind of public anthropological work that I want to do. And a lot of that has to do with recognizing the importance and value and usefulness of some of the skills and tools that we are taught. So one thing, I said this earlier on, but ethnography is an incredibly powerful tool, not just to produce work, but to just live and navigate the modern workplace, right? And the modern economic system. Like, economic anthropologists are incredibly well equipped, actually, just experientially, to understand organizational dynamics, to sit in a tense, conflict-fraught meeting with, clients or stakeholders, right? And try to help understand, like, what's behind what's being said, what are the relationships that are structuring the ways that people are acting, and in particular, understanding the ways that people's choices are constrained. And so, we don't operate, anthropologists know this, we don't operate in a world of pure agency. And so what are the conditions of possibility that are structuring people's choices and behavior? All of those things are so incredibly valuable, just like from being able to operate in the modern world, in the workplace, in the marketplace kind of thing. And then, on the other hand, there are definitely things that we can teach ourselves, or, that we could train on, that would make the application of those tools easier. And honest to goodness, and I say this a lot, and it's funny, but it's true, like, I wish that I was better at Excel and PowerPoint. Because these are the tools. This is like the lingua franca of the work that I do. And so, if I want to find ways to shape people's thinking and my interactions with them, like sometimes a spreadsheet is a really good way to do that. Very often a good deck is a great way to do that because that's the way people expect to be communicated with. So I definitely, that's silly, but it's also like also, could be very useful. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely ways that we could change anthropological training. But so much of it, I think, is also about recognizing the value that training already has.
Yeah, that's fantastic, I think, and really important point in terms of what anthropology has to offer us in terms of skills and insights into how people work. So my final question is a little bit future oriented. So I'd love to hear more about any new exciting work that you are beginning in the midst of. What's sort of driving you, inspiring you, and exciting you currently?
Well, let me start with this. It's really hard to think about the future right now, Tanya. I think that's true for a lot of people. One of the people who became a very close mentor of mine, Jane Geyer, may her memory be a blessing, taught us really about the dangers of evacuating the future, especially the near future. But that's what it feels like has accelerated or intensified over the past couple of years. This real inability to think about the future because you're so both committed to and demanded to respond to the present, to the immediate present. Even if we can really think about the far future, thinking about like planning is really hard, personally and professionally, and in terms of organizations. I think one of the things that I've learned working with credit unions is that they are all exhausted by planning too. All of the leaders of these financial services organizations, they don't want to do any more strategic planning because they've been doing it constantly for 2 years, day in and day out. It's just an exhausting place to be. But I do have ideas. I want to write a book about credit unions and about cooperative finance. I've been doing that for a while. I'm going to try to carve out some time to do that more sustainably. But I'm really committed to institution building. And so I really want to find ways to create spaces and support for non-instrumentalist thinking, and yet also provide the people doing that thinking with the kind of scaffolding that they need to take it and its outcomes and make it available and usable to do stuff in the world. A think tank is an unfortunate phrase, but I do think that there's something really powerful about being able to support people to do that thinking, to lift their heads up out of the demands of day-to-day operations and do some of the planning for the future. And so, if I'm not doing it myself, I would love to be able to leverage my position to be able to allow others to do that. Not only academics, but credit union executives too, the fellow travelers in industry and nonprofits and government. I think overall, I think one of the things that I have been most struck by in trying to navigate whatever this transition or this interface is that, one of the kind of core lessons of contemporary social science, like we have to take that core lesson seriously. So that core lesson, at least for me, is about the blurriness between facts and effects, theory and practice, ideas and their material manifestation in the world, right? That's like a very Cartesian way of putting it, but like the real, since Austin, since Butler, so many of our grand theorists, capital T, have tried to teach us that thought is practice. And if we're going to think about what public anthropology is and can be, I think we have to take that really seriously. So what that means is that, facts are and have effects. Realities are made, even if they do making, they do stuff in the world on their own. And ideas and representations, the stuff that we're thinking about, the stuff that we're trying to write down or communicate, those are always also interventions into particular material and political formations. And so if we want to take seriously the link between scholarship or our thinking as scholars and the worlds outside of academia or inside of academia, again, no great divide, to which that scholarship is trying to attend, then in some ways, I think there is no theory, only politics. And by that, I mean that the future of our work as public anthropologists may not lie in the programmatic, right? But in this labor that we've been talking about of organization, relationship making, and relationship sustaining, and honestly, institution building and network building. So it's not that there isn't a place for concepts or imagination. That's not what I'm trying to say. But insofar as we mobilize that, they're always going to be mobilized in particular and pragmatic ways, whether we want that or not.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. And I can say that I'm definitely really looking forward to what you do at Filene, but also your book and many other projects in the future. So thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been enlightening and I've learned a great deal. And it's also been incredibly inspiring for me to listen to you think and talk about your work. So thank you so much for being here.
That's humbling, Tanya. Thank you so much for having me. I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to take a pause myself and think about this stuff with you.
Thanks so much.